There's a certain kind of moment in gaming history where a company isn't just chasing success, it's testing a belief. A moment where designers stop asking what players want and start asking what players are capable of handling. In the early 1990s, Square found itself at one of those moments. The Super Famicom had arrived. Role playing games were becoming bigger, clearer, and more cinematic. And Square had just redefined the genre with Final Fantasy IV, a game that taught players exactly how it worked, exactly where to go, and exactly what it expected of them. So instead of repeating that formula, Square released something else. On January 28, 1992, they launched Romancing SaGa, a role playing game that refused to explain itself, refused to guide the player, and refused to guarantee that everyone would walk away with the same experience. Today, we're telling the story of how Romancing SaGa came to exist, not just as a game, but as a statement, a rejection of linear design, a challenge to player expectations, and the moment when the Saga series truly found its identity on a home console. So settle in, because we're about to explore a world that doesn't hold your hand and never ever apologize for it on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 283rd episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. This week, we are looking at Romancing SaGa, Square's bold 1992 Super Famicom role playing game that rejected linear storytelling, traditional leveling systems, and player hand holding in favor of experimentation, freedom, and discovery. It's a game that didn't just expand the Saga series, it defined its philosophy and helped shape one of the most unconventional RPG lineages in gaming history. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co host, who would absolutely blame the game when a bad choice comes back to haunt him 10 hours later. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, this is not a joke question. 283 episodes in, I thought we'd do something completely different. Legit question. Do you like video games that trust the player completely, even when that trust means letting you fail in permanent ways, ways that you can't undo?
I mean, I have not played a ton of games like that. I know that Dark Souls had a quest line that you had to do very specifically that I often missed, but I never really felt that I missed a whole lot by not doing it. So I don't have the best experience to say yes or no. So I think it's a cool concept, but I can understand the frustration if you find out that it really screws you out later on.
That 10 hours later, there was a question that was asked that affects right now, and you can't go back 10 hours and choose the other way.
Yeah, no, that would definitely be frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, some people like that, some people don't like it. I think it's way more common now than it used to be. Also, because now we're way better at branching narratives. And in the past, when you used to make mistakes, sometimes you would make mistakes like that were literally game ending, as in you couldn't go any further in the game. You'd have to start the game over when you hit walls like that. And we don't really have those anymore either.
Yeah, that would be pretty frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. End states for games used to be a real thing for a real thing. That's not even a joke. All right. Well, our topic today, Romancing Saga. Are you familiar with the Saga series at all?
Negatory.
Negatory. So this is a complete gap for you. Do you
Yep.
know what the Saga series is?
I'm going to assume it's a set of games
Good
that tell a
choice.
story.
Very good choice. Very astute observation. Did you gather that by watching or listening to 282 episodes of this podcast?
No, I based that off of the name Saga.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that makes a whole lot more sense. Okay, all right. Well, before I get to the story on hand for today, why don't you share with our listeners some other things that happened during this week in gaming history?
All right, first up, on January 26, 1987, Dragon Quest II Luminaries of the Legendary Line was released for the Famicom in Japan, building directly on the success of the original Dragon Quest. Developed by Chunsoft and published by Enix, the game introduced a party system that allowed players to recruit two additional heroes, expanding both combat strategy and storytelling scope. Featuring a larger world map, tougher dungeons, and a more ambitious narrative centered on stopping the sorcerer Hargon, Dragon Quest II pushed console RPGs forward despite its famously punishing difficulty. Its ideas helped define the structure of party based RPGs for decades to come, and we took a deeper look at its development and legacy in episode 231 of the podcast. So go check it out if you want to learn more.
We did a different episode on the first one, and then that is completing the trilogy. Episode 231 is Dragon Quest 2 and Dragon Quest 3. So if you'd like to learn all about that original Dragon Quest trilogy, we have that content in our library. So as Rob said, go check it out.
Yeah. Next, on January 31st, 1992, X-Men the arcade game was released to arcades by Konami, quickly becoming one of the most recognizable multiplayer cabinets of the early 1990s. The side scrolling beat 'em up let players choose from iconic X Men characters like Wolverine, Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Dazzler as they fought Magneto and his forces across vibrant, comic inspired stages. What truly set the game apart was its rare 6-player cabinet, allowing large groups to play cooperatively at once, a technical and social novelty for arcades at the time. With bold visuals, voice samples, and faithful use of Marvel Comics characters, X Men the arcade game became a fan favorite and remains a defining example of how licensed games could thrive when paired with strong multiplayer design.
I loved that arcade cabinet. That thing, no joke. Everything in there, the bold visuals, the voice samples, like that was one of those that the attract mode would definitely like just capture your attention. And it was what, 6 players, So like how many arcades could you walk up to and play 6 people at a time? Like it was a ton of fun.
I mean, how many people had 5 friends back then? I know you didn't.
I did not. I would just drop in on strangers.
Oh, well, hey, that's a good way to meet people. Or just to make them angry.
They would humor me for a match and then walk away.
Fair enough.
Hmm.
Well, back on topics that I actually know and can talk about. On January 31st, 1997, Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan for the PlayStation, marking a major turning point for both the role playing genre and the medium as a whole. Developed by Square, the game transported players to the industrial city of Midgar, following Cloud Strife and his allies as they confronted the Shinra Corporation and the mysterious Sephiroth. With its cinematic presentation, pre rendered 3D environments, and emotionally driven storytelling, Final Fantasy VII pushed JRPGs into the mainstream and reached audiences far beyond the genre's traditional fanbase. Its success helped establish the PlayStation as the dominant console of the era and demonstrated the narrative potential of large scale video games. We explored its development, themes, and lasting impact in depth back in episode 179, so you know what to do.
Go read a book.
I was going to suggest listening to episode 179 to learn more about Final Fantasy VII, but you can go shove rocks.
You can go read a
That's
book
if that's
about
what you
it.
want to do. Do what you want to do. It's your decision.
Fair enough.
Next up, on January 25th, 2001, Onimusha Warlords was released for the PlayStation 2 in North America, becoming one of Capcom's earliest original successes on the console. Set in a supernatural take on Japan's Sengoku period, the game followed samurai Samanosuke Akachi as he fought demonic Genma while uncovering a conspiracy rooted in real history. Originally conceived as a feudal reimagining of Resident Evil, Onimusha carved out its own identity by blending fixed camera action, puzzle solving, and its signature soul absorption system. Its cinematic presentation and dark tone helped it stand out during the PS2's launch window, and its commercial success established Onimusha as a major franchise for Capcom in the early 2000s.
I've never played Onimusha, but doesn't a feudal reimagining of Resident Evil sound incredibly interesting?
It absolutely does. I mean, any kind of reimagining of Resident Evil is really cool, but in feudal Japan, that's freaking fantastic.
Agreed.
And last up for this week in gaming history, it was on January 29th, 2004, when Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green were released in Japan for the Game Boy Advance, reintroducing players to the Kanto region that started it all. Developed by Game Freak and published by Nintendo, the games were full remakes of the original Pokemon Red and Blue, rebuilt with updated visuals, modernized mechanics, and quality of life improvements. While the core journey remained familiar, Fire Red and Leaf Green incorporated features from later generations, including abilities, held items, and a new post game Sevi Island storyline that expanded the original world. Designed to bridge longtime fans and a new generation of players, the remakes preserve the charm and structure of the originals while aligning them with the evolving Pokemon formula. Their success helped solidify remakes as a core pillar of the franchise and demonstrated how classic games could be refreshed without losing their identity.
We did an episode on that, didn't we? Not Fire Red and
I
Leaf Green.
No, not on that. We did one on red, blue, and yellow,
Those
which
were
were
good.
the original
Good.
releases in America, and these were the reimaginings. But I felt that they were just as damn good as the originals. And quite honestly, I know that Heart Gold and Soul Silver are great, and that's the last of the remakes that I ever played. But I feel that Pokemon has done really good about the remakes for the ones that I've done. Maybe it sucked after I stopped doing the remakes. I don't know. But Fire Red, Leaf Green, if you've never played and you can get your hands on a copy, I would recommend.
We'll take that under recommendation because me and Pokemon.
Your favorite Pokemon is Agumon.
I don't even know what that means. So yeah.
Well, that's a Digimon, Dave. So um,
Darn rats.
let's talk about something you do know. So how about we get to today's topic?
Yeah, let's get to today's topic. All right, Rob. To understand our topic today, Romancing SaGa, we really have to rewind all the way back to the beginning. Not 1992, not even the Super Famicom era, but to a kid growing up in Kyushu named Akitoshi Kawazu. Because if there's one constant in this entire franchise, it's really that Saga is really just Akitoshi's brain on a cartridge. He wasn't a quiet kid hiding in the corner drawing monsters. He has described himself as the opposite: rowdy, outspoken, and eager to be in the middle of things. He fell in love with science fiction early, and once the Star Wars boom hit Japan, he dove headfirst into anything that felt futuristic: Star Trek, tabletop RPGs, Apple II computer games, and eventually this led him to the Ultima series. In fact, Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar was the game that rewired his understanding of what video games could be. He once told a story of meeting a simple NPC dancer in the game and realizing that a tiny, low resolution sprite could offer emotional meaning that had nothing to do with winning or losing. It wasn't then about defeating a boss or clearing a dungeon to him, it was about inhabiting a world. That idea that games could reward players with experiences outside of victory stuck with him. But before he ever stepped into video game development, Kawazu entered the industry from the journalism side. A school friend invited him to do part time work for Beep, which was SoftBank's general gaming magazine. There, he wrote hardware impressions, product reviews, and whatever odd assignments the staff needed. It wasn't a glamorous job, he has said, but it was very eye opening. Gave him access to new video games, early development trends, and a clearer understanding of how studios thought about systems and player experience. Later, he said that his time as a journalist broadened his curiosity and helped shape the way he evaluated game design. And this is knowledge that he carried with him from then all the way through his development career. While working at Beep, he came across an advertisement for a Famicom disk system game called Suisho New Dragon, developed by a company he had never heard of, Square. And right next to that ad was something even more interesting: a job listing. He applied, not expecting anything to come of it, and somehow found himself interviewing with Hiromichi Tanaka and then Hironobu Sakaguchi. Even though the hiring window had technically closed, something about his enthusiasm got their attention. So in 1985, he was hired at Square. His first credited game wasn't a role playing game, which is what he's known for today, at all. It was actually Rad Racer for the NES. Badass game, by the way, where he worked as a graphic designer. But as we've learned in previous episodes, from this point, Square's ambitions kind of really quickly shifted. Sakaguchi wanted to respond to Enix's success with Dragon Quest, and so his rallying cry throughout the studio, according to Kawazu, was let's aim to make a game that will surpass Dragon Quest. Now, as we know from the episode, that project became Final Fantasy, and Kawazu was put in charge of battle design. He pulled heavily from the things he knew best, right? Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop mechanics, and elemental systems. But his real impact, his design personality, starts to really show up in Final Fantasy II, the sequel. Well, Final Fantasy I embraced job classes, experience, and predictable leveling curves. Final Fantasy II tossed almost all of that out the window. Kawazu championed a nurture, not nature philosophy. So in Final Fantasy II, characters improved based on the actions they performed. You swing a weapon to grow stronger, you cast spells to improve magic, you take damage to grow more resilient. It was bold, it was experimental, and depending on who you ask, it was either completely brilliant or absolutely bonkers. But what it was unmistakably Akitoshi. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's his design personality. Even if the mainline Final Fantasy series moved away from his ideas, Akitoshi didn't. Akitoshi didn't. He carried his ideas with him when Square's president, Masafumi Miyamoto, asked the company to create a hit for Nintendo's new handheld console, the Game Boy. At the time, Tetris was dominating handheld gaming, and Miyamoto wanted a game for Square to compete in the handheld market. Akitoshi and Koichi Ishii disagreed. They felt that they were on differing sides. Ishii felt that competing with Tetris was pointless. So instead of a puzzle game, which is kind of what they were leaning towards as they're having this conversation, they pitched the thing that Square was best at, which was a role-playing game. Now, this became Akitoshi SaGa, or as we know it here in the West, Final Fantasy Legend. And from the very beginning, Akitoshi saw it as a chance to build something Final Fantasy couldn't be, right? This was a smaller, stranger, more experimental game that was more willing to break the rules. The team leaned into every limitation the Game Boy threw at them. And this is where Akitoshi's design philosophy really started to distinguish itself. Let's remember that this is 1989. The Game Boy pretty much revolutionized handheld consoles. And as a result, any genre on a handheld doesn't exist. So there are no other handheld role-playing games. Game Boy has no color, tiny storage space, and a sound chip that could realistically only play like 3 notes at a time. So taking what they knew, a role-playing game like Final Fantasy, and fitting it into these constraints forced the team to rethink everything that they knew about making a role-playing game. The game's artist, Ryoko Tanaka, had to create entire environments in monochrome. There were no shades, no gradients, no visual tricks. Everything had to be readable in black and white. So instead of leaning on color to define mood, she used shape, contrast, and pattern, creating towns, dungeons, and landscapes that genuinely relied on the player's imagination to fill in. That gave the game this stark, almost storybook quality that really set it apart from the other colorful, Famicom role playing games that everyone was used to that Square made. And then there was the music, those three chips, famed Final Fantasy composer Nobu Uematsu, already a legend from the Final Fantasy theme, suddenly had to squeeze all of the same type of emotion and melody and atmosphere out of, again, three simultaneous tones. No percussion tracks, no layered harmonies, no sweeping arcs. Every musical line had to multitask. It was melody, rhythm, and tone, all carried with emotional weight, with no ability to put anything underneath it. But probably the biggest departure from the other role playing games that's unique here is the gameplay itself. This is where the Final Fantasy Legend really stands apart, because what Akitoshi built wasn't just unusual for the time, it was absolutely unprecedented. Most role playing games in the late 80s followed the same formula: defeat enemies, earn experience points, level up, and repeat. Characters grew on level curves, right? Predictable growth on a fixed path. Akitoshi threw all that out the window, completely threw it out the window. Instead, he built three different character races, each that had their own entirely different progression system. Humans did not level up from battle at all. They only grew stronger
Oh,
by consuming items.
interesting.
So there were literal stat boosting consumables that would increase strength, agility, or health. So that meant that players had to pick and choose which attributes to focus on to kind of manually shape their characters. There was no other role playing game at the time that would handle that level of control, that specific finesse, that customization to the player. There were mutants. Mutants grew exactly the opposite way. If humans you could completely control, mutants you could not control in any way, shape, or form. It was completely unpredictable. After battles, their stats might go up. They might not go up at all. They may gain a new ability. They may lose an old ability. Mutants could shift over time into totally different builds, and that turned them into literal living gambles. You weren't building a character, you were curating one and praying that it worked out the way you wanted it to.
Wild.
And then there were monsters. Absolutely. I mean, this man was crazy. But monsters, the third race, they transformed by eating meat that was dropped by enemies. And depending on what was eaten, they would mutate into either stronger forms or weaker forms. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you accidentally downgrade them. And so you had humans that you completely controlled, but you had mutants and monsters. And monsters you could kind of control because of the meat, but realistically, it's two ends: humans with all the control, and monsters and mutants which were gambles. Just mutants were a complete gamble, and monsters were kind of a gamble. So, and again, when you step back and look at all these systems, they're exactly the opposite of what everything else was doing at the time. The ones we talked about: Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest. We did an episode of Phantasy Star recently. They all rewarded you as a player with, you know, predictability. You would grind and you'd get stronger. The Final Fantasy Legend, on the other hand, rewarded curiosity and improvisation and risk. When you look at Akitoshi's game design philosophies now and you compare it to here, you start to see the core of his design identity. RPGs don't need to be about grinding. That was not the way he builds a role playing game. They are about discovery. Here in this basic level, they were about discovering characters, but eventually that discovery mutates into other things. The Final Fantasy Legend becomes Square's first million unit selling game. So a sequel follows, and then a third follows. After the Game Boy trilogy exceeded every expectation that Square had for it, something big happened behind the scenes. Instead of Square going to Nintendo, Nintendo came to Square. They came with a request that was half opportunity, half challenge. They had a new console, the Super Famicom. It was more powerful than anything else that was out there at the time. And it needed role playing games that could show off what that extra horsepower could do. Final Fantasy was already heading there. They were planning on bringing that series to the Famicom, but Nintendo specifically requested SaGa on the system too. Akitoshi agreed, but he wasn't interested in just making a prettier version of the Game Boy games. If SaGa was going to move onto 16-bit hardware, it needed to grow into something new, something more elegant, more ambitious, and more open-ended than any other console role-playing game at the time. So around 1990, Square began an unusual production structure. There were two SaGa projects in parallel. A brand new Osaka studio took on what would become Final Fantasy Legend 3 for the Game Boy. This all kind of was happening as 2 and 3 in the middle, while Akitoshi and his Tokyo team began shaping Romancing SaGa for the Super Famicom. The Tokyo team would eventually become the core SaGa team. It was the project that brought together all the people who would define this entire series for decades to come. Illustrator Tomomi Kobayashi, for example, had never worked on a video game before. Her early character illustrations were so painterly and detailed that when they were first shown to the programmers panicked because they had no idea how to translate that type of almost watercolory art style into limited 16-bit sprites. But Akitoshi insisted that this type of romantic watercolor aesthetic was the heart of the world he wanted to build. And so he asked sprite artists like Kazuko Shibuya to study Kobayashi's artwork and reinterpret it into what he called expressive silhouettes and flowing, exaggerated poses. And that's why Romancing SaGa, for starters, looks why it does. It's because they took, for starters, Kobayashi's brushwork and they adapted it into pixels. This is also the point in which composer Kenji Ito stepped into the SaGa series. He had co-composed Final Fantasy Legend 2 with Nobu Uematsu, but he was given the helm this time, and so this was the first time that he would shape an entire soundtrack on his own. Akitoshi envisioned a more lyrical romantic world using the word romantic in a literal sense. And so Kenji Ito was asked to create themes that lean more into warm strings and delicate woodwinds. He wanted them to make atmospheric melodies. So compared to Final Fantasy's big heroic anthems, Romancing SaGa ended up sounding softer, right? More wistful, more mysterious. But the real challenge in development, the thing that would take up the most time, consume the team the most, was the story structure. Akitoshi, like I had said, had wanted to do something different. He didn't want it to be like the rest. He wanted it to be kind of open ended, and he absolutely meant open ended. So his decision was that he didn't just want one protagonist, not one main character whose story you had to follow. He wanted eight backstories, eight starting towns, eight
What?
different motivations for traveling across the same world.
That's insane.
That's insane for now standards, let alone 1990 standards.
Yeah, that's a lot. Wow.
So when
And did it happen?
it did. He brought that decision to the team, and that made the project exponentially more complicated. Developers later joked that writing Romancing SaGa felt like writing 8 novels where every chapter had to make sense no matter which book the reader opened first. NPC dialogue had to react differently depending on who was speaking to them. Quest events needed multiple entry points. Some story beats could possibly never be seen at all, depending on which protagonist the player chose. It was essentially a game where everything had to remain flexible. And this was unlike anything else that was done. So there was no experience, there was no handbook, there was nothing to grasp onto, to figure out how to do this. They were making it up as they went along. And so everyone struggled. The level designers struggled with it too. Traditional RPGs of this time were built in straight lines: town, field, dungeon, boss, rinse and repeat. But Akitoshi wanted a world built around wandering and discovery. Players would be able to stumble into towns out of order. They could skip quests. They could accidentally trigger events before learning why those events mattered. And all of this had to fit onto one Super Famicom cartridge. So, more than once, the writing and programming teams had to come together to figure out where to compress the entire story sequence, to figure out where to compress entire story sequences, because simply storing all of the dialogue was causing the game to blow past its memory limit. They were bound and determined to make this different. So everything went through that phase. Combat went through its own series of experiments. There are formation bonuses, positional advantages, early versions of what's now well known as the Spark system. It's a mechanic where characters randomly invent new skills mid battle. These were all prototyped in this early phase. The Spark system really wouldn't reach its iconic form that it's well known of now until the second Romancing SaGa game, but you can kind of feel the beginnings of it here, because here is where they started kind of trying to figure out where it goes. Akitoshi repeatedly told the team that he wanted battles where players discover power rather than plan for it. So that kind of became a guiding principle in how they developed their combat systems. I would say, though, and I already kind of alluded to it with the dialogue, that hanging over the entire production was just the constant pressure of hardware limits. Every illustration had to be simplified, every line of code had to be counted. Character sprites were redesigned again and again to reduce memory size. Quests had to be trimmed or merged. At one point, someone literally asked Akitoshi, "Do we really need 8 protagonists?" And he just smiled, which told them everything they needed to know about the answer, right? Despite all the rewrites and compromises and technical headaches, the team, obviously, because we're talking about it today, managed to pull it off. Romancing SaGa launched on January 28th, 1992, and what players received was absolutely unlike anything else on the market. It was a nonlinear role playing game that trusted players to create their own journey, to wander freely, to uncover quests naturally, and to shape the story around whichever protagonist or protagonist they chose. Its art was very expressive, painterly, even is a good way to describe it. Its music felt warmer and more intimate than anything else, and its mechanics encouraged exploration and personal decision making rather than rigid progression. It wasn't trying to be Final Fantasy. It wasn't trying to be Dragon Quest. It wasn't trying to be anything but itself. And that identity, that willingness to break the rules, to trust the player, to value discovery over direction became the philosophy that defined the SaGa series from that point forward. Rob, what really stands out about Romancing SaGa is how much freedom it gave players, even while working under intense technical limits. It trusted people to explore, to experiment, and to find their own way.
Yeah, it didn't hold your hand. It just gave you the tools and let you decide what kind of journey you wanted.
Exactly. And that's how podcasting feels when you've got the right platform, which is exactly why I use Zencaster. It's an all in one podcasting solution that makes recording simple without boxing you into a rigid process.
So I don't need to fight hardware limits or count every byte just to get started?
Not at all. You log in through your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. No complicated setup, no technical hurdles getting in the way of your ideas.
But what if something goes wrong mid session? Saga had room for experimentation. Lost recordings aren't very forgiving.
Man, we've learned that the hard way, haven't we?
That we have.
That's where Zencaster really helped us. It uses multi-layered backups, so even if your connection drops, your recording stays safe in the highest quality. You are free to experiment without worrying about losing progress.
And editing? Please tell me I don't have to micromanage every little detail.
You don't. Zencaster's post-production tools automatically clean up background noise, remove filler words, and balance your audio. You stay focused on telling your story, not fixing it.
But once I've shaped my own path, how do I share it with everyone?
That's the best part. Zencaster also lets you distribute your podcast directly to platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all from the same dashboard. From recording to release, everything happens in one place.
So, creative freedom without technical stress. I'm on board. How do our listeners get started?
Go to zencaster.com/pricing, use our code all one word memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you've got a story you want to tell, this is by far the easiest way to let it unfold.
So, take the path you want. No guide arrows required.
That's right. Head over to Zencaster, use our offer code all one word memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month.
Now, let's follow Saga down the paths it inspired next.
So when Romancing SaGa finally released in Japan, like I said, on January 28th, 1992, Square wasn't just launching another role playing game for the Super Famicom. This was literally only their second Famicom title. It was coming right on the heels of Final Fantasy IV, and it represented something very different from what players expected out of the company. Because let's be honest, there were some people that weren't handheld gamers. And if you weren't a handheld gamer and your only experience with a Square RPG was the Final Fantasy series, then this was going to be your first time in the Saga series, right? Because it was only handheld at this point. So it was going to be something completely different for you. Romancing SaGa didn't arrive quietly. It shot straight to the top of the Famitsu sales charts and stayed there for weeks. By the early 2000s, it had sold just under 1 million copies in Japan alone. And by the mid 2000s, total sales had passed 1.3 million worldwide. I would like to point out that the original Romancing SaGa is a Japanese only release. It was never localized anywhere else for a while, eventually. But on the Super Famicom, it was Japanese only. So 1 million copies in the throughout the 90s in Japan alone is super impressive. I mean, for a game that deliberately rejected everything else they did, that's remarkable, you know?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Frankly, the response to Romancing SaGa was never simple. Critics immediately noticed that this did not look like Square's other RPGs. If you look at, I just brought up Famitsu, their reviewers were mixed on the visuals. They often compared them rather unfavorably to Final Fantasy IV because they had I would say, a more polished presentation. But that's but where this game stood out, frankly, and where it earns lasting praise, what it's known for now, the series is known for now, what's frankly its structure, what they called the free scenario system, with its nonlinear progression, with its 8 interchangeable protagonists, was widely recognized as something new and not just different, recognized as being genuinely ambitious. At the same time, though, if you go back and look, a lot of players bounced off of it hard. Romancing SaGa didn't explain its rules. It didn't warn you when an event could permanently lock you out of a quest. It didn't tell you how life points worked until you learned the consequences firsthand. Characters could fall behind in ways that weren't immediately obvious, and it was entirely possible to wander into content you weren't ready for with no clear path back. In many ways, that friction became part of its identity. The players who stuck with Romancing Saga didn't just finish it, they compared experiences. They talked about which protagonists they chose, which fate stones they found or missed, which characters they ended up losing forever. The game encouraged replay not by offering radically different endings per se, but by ensuring that no two run throughs felt the same. That sense of discovery and sometimes that sense of loss, depending on how you went about it, was the reward. And that response told Square something important, right? That they're out there when you were selling a million copies throughout the 90s. It's obvious there's a dedicated audience out there that want that kind of open-ended nonlinear design. And of course, we now know that open worlds are a whole genre, so that was always the case. After Romancing Saga shipped in early 1992, a lot of its staff got pulled onto Final Fantasy projects, and that effectively hit pause on the idea of just, okay, we're doing okay, let's just crank out a Romancing Saga 2. In later interviews, Akitoshi Kawazu admitted that he was actually grateful for that delay because if he had been forced to move fast, the sequel might have ended up feeling mechanically similar to the first game. Instead, when they were finally able to get back to production on a new game in the series, he was able to use that breathing room to kind of pause and rethink the whole structure from the ground up. So when Romancing Saga 2 released on December 10th, 1993, it wasn't just 8 protagonists again. It was a single kingdom called Avalon, told across generations. You play as either an emperor or an empress, and when one ruler falls, you choose the next. The game's hook becomes inheritance, right? Skills, progress, momentum carry forward through dynasties as you fight the bad guy, who are called the Seven Heroes. They're figures that were once the world's savior, but are now the world's problem, which is really kind of cool, actually.
Uh, that is a different concept. That is pretty sick.
Romancing Saga 3 arrives November 11th, 1995, and it swings back towards the first game structure. There are 8 protagonists again, now with a much heavier emphasis on side content and design that really encouraged players to get lost in the world on purpose. They were actively trying to build a game where players could enjoy wandering into character specific systems. The battle system and from Romancing Saga 2, that Spark learning system kind of are the glue that bring it all together. And so you have 3 games, right? You have 3 different Romancing Saga games from this era. There are more games now, but you have these original, the original foundation of the series. And when we look back at it, there's a really simple way to frame what this trilogy does without getting into too much detail. Romancing Saga establishes a formula. Romancing Saga 2 proves that you can reshape it pretty radically without losing what made the first one special. And then Romancing Saga 3 takes all of that and just pushes the idea of an open world that they built into something much bigger, into a lot of events, side systems, and player curiosity, right? And realistically, from there, after this initial trilogy, the legacy of the Saga series gets really interesting because the series doesn't just continue in a straight line, just like the series itself. It really mutates in weird ways. It jumps to the PlayStation with a game called Saga Frontier in the late 90s. There's a very divisive entry in this series called Unlimited Saga. And then, frankly, the series just kind of spends years surviving through ports, remakes, and re-releases until it finds modern footing again. And that's what is important to keep in mind. Romancing Saga wasn't just a hit in 1992. It was a proof of concept for an entire philosophy of role-playing game design that Square just kept revisiting, refining, and then reintroducing to new audiences. And that's why you eventually get something like the modern one, Saga Scarlet Grace, that brings the game back to consoles, and why the modern era just becomes this steady drumbeat of old games made playable again, because that's it. But genuinely, that brought a, I wouldn't say forgotten, but that brought a Japanese only oddity to the rest of the world. Romancing Saga and its sequels existed in this strange place. They were foundational in Japan, hugely influential within Square, but effectively invisible to much of the world. If you didn't import games or read fan translations or hang around very specific corners of role playing game fandom, the Saga series might as well have not existed to you. But that really started to change in the early 2000s. The first real attempt to bring Romancing Saga to a new generation came with Romancing Saga Minstrel Song that was brought to the PlayStation 2. They didn't treat this as a simple port. Akitoshi and the team treated it as a second pass at an original idea. They restored cut content to this game. They layered in mechanics from later Saga games. They reworked the presentation entirely. Everything was moved into 3D. The soundtrack was fully rearranged. The game was rebalanced with added tutorials and a clearer structure. So this was the Romancing Saga that Western audiences were brought to, right? This is how we know the Saga series. For longtime fans, let's just say that the way everyone looked at Minstrel Song was very mixed, right? For longtime fans, Minstrel Song was like a definitive statement. It was like a greatest hits compilation of Saga design areas. For newcomers, though, we were experiencing the Saga series the way the Japanese gamers experienced it in 1992, right? It was strange and different. It had a art style that was unique and, and polarizing. It had gameplay systems that were kind of dense. And even with all these improvements, the Saga series still doesn't behave like other role playing games that are on the shelf, and this came out in 2005, and we could still say that. That tension defined its reception to Western audiences, but it also established something really important. And it showed that Square Enix was willing to take the risk of reintroducing Saga on its own terms. And from there, you kind of see the trajectory of the Saga series shift. Instead of these big high budget reinventions, Square Enix begins focusing on, I guess you can call it, preservation and accessibility. The Wonder Swan color version was made. It restored content that had been cut during cartridge limits. Mobile versions came out that were quietly keeping the game alive as the older platforms faded away. And then again, eventually all these remasters arrived. These were versions that didn't try to reinvent the games, but they strove to make them playable again without sanding off the rough edges that fans came to love. Romancing Saga 2 and Romancing Saga 3 finally received worldwide remasters in the late 2010s, roughly. And at that point, that was really important because for the first time, all of the Western gamers could finally experience that original trilogy legally in English without workarounds. These weren't attempts to modernize Saga into something it wasn't. They genuinely preserved the systems, they preserved the difficulty, they preserved all those idiosyncrasies, the being able to, you know, miss a quest that because of a decision you made far, far ago. But it did add quality of life features. We got auto saves and clearer menus and optional guidance. Romancing SaGa by that point wasn't a historical footnote. It wasn't a recommendation with a dozen caveats. Go to this website, get it imported from Japan. Go to this website, get the English translation, and read the English translation as you play along. Right. By this point, it was playable to us. It was available. It was readily there, inviting a new audience to engage with the Saga series on its own terms. So these remasters weren't about chasing trends. They were really about keeping a lineage alive. They were making sure that this style of RPG design that valued experimentation, consequence, and player driven stories didn't disappear just because it was Japanese specific in the 90s. It or because it didn't fit into the mainstream. It brought this uniqueness to to modern audiences. One thing I will say, the last thing I'll say about Romancing SaGa, I keep going back to how it's unique. I keep going back to how it's different. There's merit in that no one ever tried to make this into something that it isn't. They never tried to shove this into the form factor of a standard role playing game. They never tried to do anything but let the Saga series be the Saga series carefully, repeatedly, and without ever apologizing for what it is. And that more than anything might be its most lasting legacy. And of course, legacies are what we do on this podcast. We have our own legacy, another 282 episodes for you to check out, many of which are about legacies all in themselves. So if you'd like to learn about any of these other gaming dynasties, you can of course listen to other episodes of ours anywhere you listen to your podcast, or by checking out our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
You can find a calendar of our future episode topics to know what we'll be talking about in our coming weeks. You can find a link to our Discord where you can chat with Dave and I about a lot of things. You never know. You can find links to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor. Dave?
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've even covered a few places. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's a fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning. And in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think that what I found most interesting is the level up system that you talked about.
All the
That's
weird ones?
yeah, the having to have items for humans, and that you could the meat was for the one.
Yeah, no, I gotcha. Meat would randomly the meat would mutate you. The
I
thing
just
with
think that that's a cool concept. That it's not something in place at normal games. Hey, you kill, you level up, but this one you had different things that did different effects for different classes, and I think that that's a really cool concept. It's not something you really hear about, and I feel like it adds a level of difficulty that we just don't really see.
I discovered Final Fantasy Legend as an adult. Never played it on the Game Boy as a kid. And I got to tell you, it was so confusing. It was so confusing. And we don't read instruction books or anything, so we don't pay attention. So you got to imagine that I'm I probably played it in my 30s, and I have 20 plus years of traditional role playing behind me. So you walk into Final Fantasy Legend and you expect it to play like a role playing game. And I got to tell you, you have no idea how confused I was as I was trying to figure out the level up mechanics without anything. I think I end up looking it up online or something like that because my brain simply could not register what was going on. I could not figure out how to level up my characters at all because of the baggage, right? Because it's so different from what everything else is. So, yeah, it was unique, really cool.
Yeah, I think that's it would definitely be difficult to understand and be able to get right. And I understand you having to look it up because if you can't figure it out, I granted we have the ability to do so nowadays. It's not like in the past where you had to just kind of figure it out on your own or hope someone else played it or buy the strategy guide or like Nintendo Power or whatever would be available for this game. But it's a cool concept. I think I honestly would kind of be into something like that. I think if that was done in more games, I think it could be a lot of fun.
I
So
agree.
that's my takeaway. What about yourself?
I didn't really talk about it in this episode. It's a good place to put it here because it's what I learned. It's a good addition. I never knew that the Saga series was the Final Fantasy Legends series. There's no reason for it. When they brought the Saga series to North America, they just tacked the Final Fantasy name on it because that was the brand recognition. They wanted to keep the brand recognition here in the United States. It doesn't attach to any Final Fantasy game. It has no other relation to the Final Fantasy series. It just is what it is. It's the Final Fantasy Legend because that's what was popular at the time. But I never knew that the two series were anything. Like I always thought Romancing SaGa was the beginning of the series and it went from there. I never knew that it was a progression because the in Japanese the Final Fantasy Legend are Saga games, and so those are the first three that go in through the modern era. So that's kind of what I learned through this. That's a big takeaway for me.
Yeah, I think that that's a great one as well. It's kind of cool when you find that out and learn these kind of things, and that's why we're here week in and week out to learn and expand our knowledge of games that we may know nothing about or that we may have experience with and just want to know better.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, before I wrap it up and take it into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I will just take a moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to have you along with us as we go upon our podcasting saga. So thank you.
That brings us to the end of, all pun intended, a one possible route through Romancing SaGa's story. At its core, this was never just a role playing game in the traditional sense about swords, spells, or I don't know, saving the world from a dark god. It was really an argument about what role playing games could be different, how they could be different, and about what players were willing to accept in exchange for open world freedom, I guess. Romancing SaGa didn't try to be comforting. It didn't guide you gently from moment to moment or reassure you that you were doing things the right way. Instead, it trusted you to wander and to fail, to miss things, to live with the consequences of those choices. The stories didn't wait for you. Characters didn't revolve around you. It's unique in that it's one of the earliest games where the world moved on, whether you understood it or not. And that was really the point. What started as Square's second Super Famicom role playing game became a blueprint for an entire design philosophy, one that valued discovery over completion, curiosity over certainty, personal experience over shared outcomes. The series progressed through sequels and remakes and reinterpretations, but that philosophy never really went away, right? It evolved, it fractured, it got put back together. Sometimes it frustrated players, sometimes it pushed them away, but it never ever compromised on this core belief. The need to wander, the need to discovery, the fact that role playing games don't need to explain themselves perhaps to be meaningful. I think looking back, Romancing SaGa feels ahead of its time. Not because it was bigger or flashier than its peers, but because it was willing to be uncomfortable and different, right? Open world game design is common nowadays. The what makes this game unique is something that we wouldn't even blink or think twice about these days. At the time though, it was very unique. It asked players to be uncomfortable. It asked them to meet them halfway, to pay attention, to experiment, to accept that maybe not every story is meant to be seen in a single playthrough. And that is perhaps its most lasting legacy. It reminds us that some worlds aren't built to be conquered, they're built to be explored. Maybe imperfectively, very personally, definitely on their own terms. Sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones that tell us exactly what happened. Instead, they're the ones that let us decide what mattered. Next week, we're trading sprawling fantasy worlds for suburban chaos. Before open worlds, before physics engines, before games worried about realism, there was a bicycle, a stack of newspapers, and a neighborhood that absolutely did not want you there. Released in 1985, Paperboy turned the daily routine of a paper route into a frantic obstacle course of dogs, breakdancers, lawnmowers, and perfectly breakable windows, blending arcade reflexes with a surprisingly sharp sense of humor about American suburbia. So join us next time as we pedal back to the arcades, dodge the mailboxes, and deliver one of the most iconic quarter eaters of the 80s on our next trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Dooba doom dap 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 doo wow.